So I asked you to come on and talk today. We both have recently sort of finished graduate school, or in the very tail end of finishing up graduate school, and I became aware of some of your research through social media, as one does these days, and we have some interesting overlaps in interest. But then there are some things that you do that are uh, really deep interest to me, questions in research ethics and bioethics, medical ethics. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that today. But before we sort of jump into the deep end and start getting out into the weeds a bit, if you just want to take a couple minutes and say who you are, what you do, and how you've come to be where you are.
Who am I? That's maybe a deeper question than I'm really prepared to answer first thing in the morning, but let's see. Okay, my name is Brian, and as you mentioned, I'm just finishing up a PhD right now. It's in philosophy and psychology. While I've been doing this, I have this kind of other career in bioethics that's been going on for some time, almost 10 years now. And so I've been trying to straddle those worlds and do a bit of both of those things at the same time. I don't know, before this, I had a career in theater where I was an actor and a singer for about 10 years. And so I guess one upshot of all of this is that I have diverse interests. I'm a curious person, and I'm like to figure out how people work and how the world works. And, you know, theater and philosophy and psychology are all different ways of pursuing that through different lenses, I suppose. So, you know, my favorite things to do are to read and write and talk with interesting people and, you know, explore this world that we live in.
So I didn't know the theater piece. We're gonna have a whole lot more to talk about than I thought, because my dissertation is actually, it's on Aristotle and the relationship between his theory of psychology and the theater and politics.
Okay.
So we may have more to talk about here than I even thought. So
Yeah, sure.
which is terrific. So then why don't we start first with graduate school? What drove you to go to graduate school, especially if you were coming from a different career or had already sort of set up a life for yourself? Why start on this second sailing, as it will, into graduate school?
Well, all the way through college, I was trying to do both academic stuff and theater stuff, and I wasn't sure where that was going to go. Part of me thought that maybe I would pursue a career in theater, and that would be my life for at least as many years as I could make it work. And I took a year off before college to do theater professionally in Seattle, which is my hometown.
Hmm.
And I'd had a couple of readings in New York and various things. And when I was in college, maybe one or two or three shows per semester I was doing. I was very heavily involved with theater. But at the same time, I was studying philosophy and cognitive science and finding myself really drawn to that. And toward the end of college, I started to have some publications that, in obscure journals, just trying my hand at that whole thing. And so by the time I graduated, I started to have the sense that I was maybe equally well positioned to pursue either of these paths. And I wasn't sure which one to choose. So I just didn't. I went off to Oxford to study experimental psychology, but I just decided to do a master's degree because I wasn't really prepared to commit to doing a PhD, which I think to me symbolically signaled the end of my theater career. I thought if I do a PhD, I'm basically saying, okay, I'm going to be an academic. So I did a master's degree, and while I was there, I did a couple of shows, one in a kind of community theater, one as a student theater production of Spring Awakening that was going on. And so I was still kind of trying to play out of both sides of my hand. And then what happened after Oxford? Well, I met somebody at Oxford, Julian Savulescu, who's the chair of the practical ethics department there. And I was doing psychology, but I had read some of this work in practical ethics, and through a series of kind of chance encounters, we ended up meeting and talking, and he has a very interdisciplinary mindset and runs a very interdisciplinary center. And so one thing led to another, and he hired me to work on a book project with him, which eventually became this book that we wrote called Love Drugs.
Mm-hmm.
But the advantage of this was that I could work on this project without having to be in Oxford. So we worked out this special contract where I could kind of keep doing my theater thing as long as I was doing research and submitted a chapter or a draft of something every so often. Now that ended up getting very protracted. It took me like 8 years to finally finish this book project, partly because I was still trying to do theater. And then I went back and did a second master's degree. I went to Cambridge and studied history and philosophy of science, because at that point I was interested in what's come to be called the replication crisis in psychology and social sciences, which I guess we'll talk about. So then I was really interested in history and philosophy of science. And then I started to think, well, is there a way to get to do both cognitive science and philosophy in some ways? Are there any PhD programs that are like that? And there are a handful, not too many, but Yale, where I did my undergraduate degree, had just started. There was one other person, Jonathan Phillips, who'd gone before me, who did a joint degree in philosophy and psychology. So they had this shell of a program that they kind of set up to accommodate that kind of an interest. And I was the, I think, second person to be admitted into that course. And so when I realized that I could at least combine those things, the philosophy and the psychology interests, although I did spend some more time, I took another year off and did theater, and I was working in a bioethics think tank at the Hastings Center, and just trying to juggle all these things. But I got exhausted, and right before my PhD, actually, I just sort of collapsed in a total state of just breakdown from
Mm.
having tried to hold all these things in the air at the same time, and living in different countries, and being in one community for 9 months and moving somewhere else. And I became so fractured that I just kind of just the bottom dropped out.
Yeah.
And so I kind of was forced to pick a thing around the time that I had decided to pick a thing, which was to do this PhD. So it's been, I don't know, 5.5 years since I've done any theater performance, and I really miss it, actually. I'd like to somehow get back into that at some point. But through a combination of finding a way to combine some of my interests to be able to pursue a joint PhD, running out of energy and not being able to keep all these things going on at the same time, I kind of narrowed my way into what I'm doing now, which is this joint PhD in philosophy and psychology.